In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to cover my top 5 starter builds for Elden Ring. These are the 5 strongest builds I think you can make, and this is kind of broken down into different archetypes. So, here we're going to have like a Paladin type build, a Mage type build, Samurai, dual wield type build, and also like a bigger weapon type build. So we'll have one of each of those. So if you're looking for like really strong builds to start your game with in those different archetypes, then watch on. There are a lot of new people playing Elden Ring right now. It's been on sale with the Steam Winter Sale, which you might have seen on our channel, and also it's on sale on PlayStation and Xbox. I think it's the cheapest it's been yet, so a lot of new people are picking up the game, and I thought it'd be a good time to get this guide into their hands. So the first build we're going to talk about is the Samurai build. This is arguably the most popular beginner build. I don't know if it's the strongest beginner build in general, but it's very, very strong, and I want to talk about how you play a Samurai at the very beginning of the game. So obviously, you're going to pick the Samurai starting class for this build, and I recommend for all new builds to go with the Golden Seed to give them an extra flask immediately. This is pretty much the easiest, best start you can have with that Golden Seed. So make sure you take a Golden Seed if you haven't. Now, one really great thing about the Samurai, in my opinion, compared to some of these other builds, is that it has all the equipment it needs to succeed right off the bat. Like, it's got a good weapon in the Uchigatana, has a good weapon skill in Unsheath, it has a good ranged option with Longbow and Mighty Shot, so you don't really need to get any new equipment to make this build work right away. So the first thing we're going to talk about with the Samurai is bleed and why it's so good on the Uchigatana, or just bleed in general is such a strong thing. When you hit an enemy enough times with a weapon that has bleed buildup like the Uchigatana has, you're going to trigger the hemorrhage status effect, and that's going to rip off a huge chunk of health off that enemy based on their max health. So the more health the enemy has, the more damage you're going to deal, making it particularly good against boss enemies that have larger health pools. Now, the thing about status effects in Elden Ring is that if you don't build them up fast enough, they'll start to dissipate off the enemy just like they will if you get hit with status effects. So if you hit an enemy with a few attacks and they aren't bleeding yet, but then you back away for 10 seconds, you're going to have to hit them a few more times in order to trigger bleed, whereas if you're hyper aggressive and you get in 4 or 5 attacks really quickly, you should be able to trigger bleed much faster. And this means that you want to play aggressively on your Samurai in order to trigger bleed, but also you want to watch out for that bleed effect to trigger so you know that if you've gotten it or not, because enemies, once bleed is triggered once, take way more hits to trigger bleed a second time. So generally you're going to be going for 1 bleed trigger, and maybe if you're lucky 2 in a boss fight. The next thing we're going to talk about is Unsheath and how to use it on a Samurai. So the Uchigatana comes with its weapon skill Unsheath. In order to be using this, you're basically going to have to either two-hand it, or you're going to have to one-hand it without the bow in your offhand. I recommend just two-handing it, keeping the bow in your offhand, or you can put the bow in your right hand and then switch back and forth between the bow and the Uchigatana. So what you're going to do here is you're going to hold L2, and that's going to put your hand on your sword sort of in its sheath, and you can either press R1 or R2 to do 2 different attacks. The R1 is sort of a slice that is like horizontal and is better at hitting groups of enemies, and the R2 is sort of an overhead slash that does more damage and more stagger damage, but it hits, in a narrower window. So it's not as good at like dealing with multiple enemies. And each of these attacks has an FP cost that you can see if you look at the weapon. The slash or the slice has an FP cost of 10, and the overhead slash has a 15 FP cost. So the R2 is more expensive FP-wise than the R1, but I think it's the better of the 2 attacks, and I would argue that you should focus on using it primarily, particularly when you're fighting bosses, because the extra stagger damage that it does can get you free attacks on a boss much more quickly than the R1. And you should practice against aggressive enemies, getting into like holding L2 and letting enemies come to you and then using Unsheath. And with this build, you'll also use arrows with your bow with this build, and Mighty Shot is a really good way to thin out enemies, so you definitely want to use that every chance you can. At the beginning of the game, you'll be crafting arrows. In order to do that, you need to buy the crafting kit from the merchant, like at the Church of Ella there. You can buy the crafting kit, and you need to buy the Nomadic Warrior's Tome or book, whatever that is, number 1, in order to be able to craft arrows. So buy both of those things, and then when you kill beasts, you can use their bones to make arrows. Now, you won't need to do this for very long, and I would urge you to do it at the beginning of the game for maybe the first couple hours to save runes in order to upgrade your weapon. But eventually you'll just be buying arrows, because the arrows you can buy deal more damage, it's faster, kind of tedious to go farm arrows and craft them over time. But at the beginning, when you're kind of building up runes, it's a good way to get free arrows. And I would say that the 2 main things you can do to make your Samurai stronger earlier on is upgrade your katana or your Uchigatana and upgrade your bow. Like, those 2 things are going to give you the most damage. putting points into dexterity and strength, which is what your weapons will be scaling with at the beginning of the game, isn't going to give you a lot of damage because they simply don't add a lot of damage because the scaling of the weapons is really poor at this point. They're low upgrades. So focus on upgrading your weapons with your runes early on and buying arrows. Those are the two things I would recommend. And one thing I want to mention too is that you can go down onto the beach and there's a merchant there very early on in the game. You can buy a short bow if you don't like the long bow, or if you find yourself using the bow more than the Uchigatana. And one thing I really love about the short bow is that it allows you to like jump and shoot and land and shoot in the same motion. It allows you to run and shoot quickly. It allows you to roll and shoot quickly. These are things the long bow can't do. And you should never be standing there and just firing with like, regular arrows. You should either be using Mighty Shot with your longbow, or you should be like rolling and running and shooting with the short bow in order to get faster animations so you can fire arrows off. Keep in mind you can jump and shoot at the same time, so you can jump away from an enemy and shoot if you need to, but the short bow is simply much better at close range fighting. So if you like using the bow, you might want to swap to a short bow. And the last thing I'll mention is that you can get a really good upgrade early on if you want to get the Nagakiba, which I consider one of the best weapons in the game, by going over to an NPC early on in the game and killing him and taking it from him. Now, this will screw up his quest line, so you might not want to do that, and it's kind of a spoiler. But if you want an even longer Uchigatana that does even more damage, you can take the Nagakiba, and that will, hold you in really good stead early on in the game, make you really, really strong. It does have higher requirements in order to use, so you might have to level up a few times before you can use it. And if you want to put Unsheath on it like you have on the Uchigatana by default, you'll have to go a little bit over into the little lake there and kill the little teardrop guy in order to get the Unsheath Ash of War. And you'll have to make sure that you gain the whetstone from the Gatefront Ruins in order to be able to go to your, Site of Grace and switch the Ash of War. These things take you a couple minutes to do at most, so it's not like a long time to get this upgrade. And those are my tips for the Samurai. This is a really strong build that is just strong from the very beginning of the game and is usable by anyone. It's very, very good if you like to play aggressively. So up next we come to the Stormblade build. This is a build that focuses on using a great sword and the Ash of War Stormblade, which not only gives you a projectile option at range, at modest range, but also allows you to fire that projectile from point blank, connecting with the weapon and the projectile for even more damage, which works really well point blank. So for this build, you're going to start with either like the hero class, which has high strength and almost enough dexterity to use the Lordsworn Greatsword, or you're going to want to pick a class that has enough dexterity and can two-hand the weapon at least with strength. So you might spend a level upgrading the hero, or you might pick another class that already has enough dexterity that has something like 11 strength that will allow you to two-hand the Lordsworn Greatsword when you get it. So the first thing you want to do with this build is you're going to want to beeline over to Gatefront Ruins. You're not going to want to fight anything along the way. You can pick up the Sites of Grace or whatever, but you're going to want to pick up the Lordsworn Greatsword there in the back of the carriage, and you're going to want to pick up the Whetstone Knife in order to be able to allow you to put Ashes of War onto that weapon. And then if you need to upgrade your stats in order to use that weapon, you're going to farm some runes there in order to do that. If not, you're just going to two-hand it. The next thing that you want to do is you're going to head up to the War Master Shack, which is not that far away, and you're going to buy the Stormblade Ash of War, and then you're going to drop it onto this weapon, which is basically the setup for this build. So now you can start using this Ash of War and the weapon that we're going to use for right now. Eventually, you'll want to swap out the Lordsworn Greatsword for a better Greatsword that you can get. But this is like the fastest way to set up this build. And literally any other Greatsword is better than the Lordsworn Greatsword pretty much. So you're going to want to do that as soon as you find a better one. So once you get it, you're going to want to upgrade it. There's a bunch of free upgrade materials essentially up on Stormhill where the trolls are. You can ride up there and let them smash it to get a bunch, or you can go into the mine and farm some there. You're going to want to get this thing up to +3 ASAP. And one of the things you're going to notice about this Ash of War is that it's not enough really to one-shot enemies early on in the game. So you're not going to use it on regular trash. You're going to use it when you need to thin out enemies, when there's like a big pack so they don't get you. And you're going to use it when you're up close against bosses. But otherwise, you're going to conserve it early on. You don't have a ton of FP. And in fact, you'll probably want to spend some levels into Mind early on between Mind and Vigor, get more health, and in order to upgrade your FP pool so you can spam this thing faster and more often. Keep in mind that the initial cast of this Ash of War costs 10 FP, but subsequent ones, if you continue to spam it, cost 6. So it's more cost effective if you're spamming it on something that's hard to kill than if you're just firing off one-off shots. And you can also buff this weapon. If you want to put fire grease on here, you'll have to buy the crafting kit from the merchant there. And then you'll have to get the Armorer's Cookbook, which is not far from the Gatefront Ruins in a little camp there. You can pick it up laying on the ground. And then you need to farm root resin and smoldering butterflies in order to craft this. Those are very much near the Warmaster Shack, so you can farm both of those really easily around there. Just grab a bunch and crate yourself a bunch of fire grease. And you won't use this all the time, but it's great when you're like in tough enemy fights. And keep in mind that the projectile will not be buffed by the fire grease, but the actual weapon itself is. So if you're spamming Stormblade point blank, you'll get that extra damage from the fire when you connect with the weapon, but you won't like send the fire on a projectile. A couple other things you can do here. You can get the Warrior Jar Shard. Close your eyes, kids, if you don't want to see this. From killing Alexander very quickly in the game, that will boost the damage of this Ash of War or this projectile by 10%. That's a lot early on in the game. You'll use this pretty much the whole game. You can get a better version if you don't kill him, but if you do want to kill him, you can get it. Again, sorry, had to be said just for a tip. Don't hate me. And then the other thing that you should do as quickly as possible is when you get to Round Table Hold, buy the Knight set. If you can wear the whole set, you'll have 51 poise. This will prevent you from being staggered while you're using Stormblade from like a regular attack from an enemy. So you can like keep spamming through their attacks and hopefully kill them quickly. So you should definitely be aiming to get 51 poise. It doesn't have to be the Knight set, but that's a very easy way to get a 51 poise armor set. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you'll want to upgrade your sword or swap out your sword for a better greatsword when you get one. You can farm the Banished Knights in Stormvale Castle for some of these. They have very, very good swords, so that's a good option. Or the Iron Greatsword later on in the game is probably even more ideal. Just for now, this will get you started, and then when you find a better one, you can swap it out and start upgrading it. And then the last thing I want to mention is that with the Ash of War, you'll eventually want to put on either like Dexterity or Strength in order to focus on one of those stats instead of having it on Standard. So make sure you set Stormblade to heavier Dexterity as you start to increase one of those stats. The next build is the Bloodblade build, and this is a build that focuses on bleed buildup and using bleed to the most, whereas the Samurai build sort of has bleed that it can benefit from occasionally, and it's not really focused on it. The Bloodblade is solely focused on this, and you will probably want to take the Warrior class at the beginning of the game. That's what I highly recommend, so that you can begin the game with 2 scimitars in order to dual wield. Now, when you're dual wielding a weapon, you're going to attack with R1 to just swing the right-hand weapon or L1 to do its sort of attack combo with both weapons at the same time. And that's what we're going to focus on in this build, using L1. And I'm not going to get into the mechanics of bleeding since I already did that in the Samurai. But the general strategy here is that we're going to get an Ash of War that we can put on these weapons early on to give them the bleeding effect, so that we can exploit the moveset of curved swords, which have a fantastic moveset when dual wielding for status effects. So the first thing you're going to want to do with this build after you've selected Warrior is you're going to want to go get at the Whetstone in the Gatefront Ruins in order to be able to put an Ash of War on your weapon. You'll need this in order to do that. So head there, get your horse, get that. And then once you have that, the next thing that you need to do is you need to get the Bloody Slash Ash of War. And the way to do that is to head south and kind of break off on the road there and go down kind of southeast. And you're going to go to Fort Height there. There is a knight up at the top there. Once you defeat him, you will gain the Ash of War. He can be kind of tough with the setup that you have. You just need to wait for his attacks and then try and punish him when he's using his, like, two-handing his sword rather than using his shield. So then once you have the Ash of War, you can put this on your right-hand weapon in order to be able to use the Bloody Slash Ash of War weapon skill, but also to set bleeding on the weapon so that it has, you know, bleed build up with your right-hand weapon at least. The next thing you want to do after that is you're going to want to go get a Lost Ash of War, and this is all the way on the southwestern part of the Weeping Peninsula, so you're going to ride all the way over there and buy this from the merchant there for 3,000 runes. Again, you know, this is a lot of riding around, but you're not really fighting anything. As long as you have the runes in order to buy the thing, which you can just get from farming regular enemies, you don't need to fight really any difficult enemies other than the one I mentioned to get the Ash of War. So then once you have the Lost Ash of War, you're going to want to get to Round Table Hold. The easiest way to do this is to ride around Stormvale Castle and use the Site of Grace there. And then Melina will come and take you to Round Table Hold. You can do this by riding the Kaled too if you want. Or you can go into the Margit fight in Stormvale Castle and just die, and it'll take you there if you want as well, if you prefer to do that. You know, obviously I wouldn't recommend that if you have a bunch of runes, but if you don't have any, that's a very fast way to do it. So then once you're there, you're going to go to the blacksmith, and you're going to duplicate the Bloody Slash Ash of War, and then you're going to slot it on your left-hand weapon, also setting the bleed So now you have bleed on both of these. The damage will go down from your regular attacks, but you'll have bleed build up on both of them, which you're going to exploit primarily in boss fights. Like, this isn't going to trigger as much when you're fighting regular enemies, but when you're fighting bosses, it rips off a percentage of their health, and because they have large health pools, it's very, very strong. So the next thing I want to talk about is upgrading your weapon. You can get some free upgrade materials up on Stormhill, or you can get some from the cave that I've already shown in this video. Those are good places, and you can buy some from the merchants around. But essentially, what you want to do here is you want to make a decision about how you're going to upgrade your weapons. Because if you upgrade your right-hand weapon, the Bloodblade Ash of War itself is going to increase in damage, which is great. But if you upgrade your left hand, that doesn't happen. But you hit with both weapons, so you do want to upgrade both of them. So I would recommend upgrading your right and left hand weapons, but focusing on your right hand if you only have enough to upgrade one of them, so that your Ash of War is always as strong as it can be. And there are a couple other things you can do to upgrade this build as well. At the Church of Pilgrimage, there's an enemy there that you can farm to get Bandit's Curved Swords. You could farm 2 of these. It might take you several hours to do, so you don't necessarily have to do it. These are some of the strongest curved swords in the game. They're going to upgrade your base damage so that you do more damage than you would with the scimitars with your attacks, which is fantastic. So if you want to easy upgrade that, it's really more just a time investment to upgrade rather than having to fight some difficult enemies or progress the game very far, getting that, a couple of those or at least one of those would be a good pickup. And then also you'll want to upgrade your armor at some point to have at least 51 poise, because this is a very aggressive build. As bleed, as I mentioned before, you need to keep attacking with bleed, keep that bleed build up from going down. You're going to be very hyper aggressive with this build, and you're going to trade damage a lot. And one of the ways you can keep attacking is by having high poise, so they don't get staggered while you're swinging to keep continuing with your combo. So, the Knight set in Round Table Hold is another really good early game set that can give you 51 poise. Again, it doesn't really matter what armor set or what combo of armor you use as long as you get at least 51. And eventually, as the game progresses, you can swap off Bloody Slash, pick some other Ash of War that you prefer to put on these weapons that also has the blood infusion if you want. But this is a good way to get, dual wield curved swords that have blood buildup on them very early in the game. So next we'll take a look at the Perfect Paladin build. This is a great beginner build. It doesn't have the raw damage of some other starter builds, but it's very tanky. It relies a lot on block counters, which I'll get into in a second, and it uses a seal in order to cast some buffs as it acquires them throughout the game. So if you're playing a Paladin build, you're probably going to be starting as either a Confessor or a Vagabond. The Vagabond has better armor in my opinion, but the Confessor starts you with a seal and some spells, even though they're not the greatest, so the choice is kind of yours. And as I mentioned, Paladins have a huge focus on block countering, and block countering is accomplished by holding the block button, an enemy hitting into your shield, and then you pressing the heavy attack button, not the light attack button, in order to perform a block counter. And this usually does a good amount of stagger damage to an enemy, and it usually staggers them, allowing you to get a critically strike. This critical strike will often finish off most enemies and has iframes, meaning that enemies cannot touch you while you're doing this animation. So if you're in the group of enemies and you pull off a block counter and they're all wailing into you, you won't take any damage. So the first thing you want to do when you start this build is you're going to want to go and get the Whetstone and the Gatefront Runes. That way you can change the Ash of War on your weapon to Sacred Blade once we get it. So you'll need this right away. And then once you have your horse, we're going to track down Sacred Blade. This is located by the Third Church of Marika, kind of located by going up by the War Master Shack and then kind of heading east along the road past the undead boss there, and then kind of down the cliffs on the right side. You'll find a Teardrop Scarab. If you kill it, you will get this Ash of War. And even though there's a little bit ways to go to get, you don't really have to fight anything along the way, so it's not very hard to get. Once you have this, you'll stick it on your weapon, which will either be the broadsword or longsword, depending on the starting class that you had. And you'll start farming Gatefront Runes, and there are a few things that you want to farm here. You want to farm a good shield, you want to farm some better armor, and you want to farm a good sword as well. So there are 3 shields that you can farm in the Gatefront Runes. There is the Lordsworn Shield, the Gilded Great Shield, and the Brass Shield. 2 of these are great shields. Brass Shield is the best medium shield you can get in the game in terms of guard boost. Guard boost allows you to reduce the amount of stamina that gets taken away from you when you block an attack. Each attack is going to remove a certain amount of stamina from you, and the higher the guard boost you have, when you block it, the less stamina it will take. So that'll allow you to block more and block counter more, because if you run completely out of stamina when an enemy hits into you, you'll be guard broken, leaving you exposed. The other thing I want to mention is that there is a difference between great shields and medium shields when it comes to their hardness, and enemies that hit into a great shield while you're blocking tend to rebuff off of it, making it easier to do a block counter, whereas medium shields do not. So an enemy that's attacking into your medium shield with a combo might go attack, attack, and if you try and block counter between those attacks, you might get struck in the process. Whereas if they attack with that same combo into a Great Shield, their first attack would cause them to bounce off, ending their combo, giving you an opening for a block counter. So Great Shields are much better for block countering than medium shields. The downside is that they tend to weigh way more and usually have higher strength requirements. Now, what's so great about the Lordsworn Shield is that it's a great shield, giving you that extra hardness, but its strength requirements are only 16. So you can actually equip this very quickly. The downside to it is that it weighs a lot, which means that you're going to have to pay attention to your equip load or you'll be fat rolling all over the place. And that it doesn't have 100% physical damage resistance, meaning you will take chip damage when you block with it. However, if you are having trouble with your block counters, this can be a great shield, give you a better opening, and you can just top yourself off with a heal spell or a flask every so often. Now, of these three shields, the Lordsworn Shield and the Brass Shield are probably the two that you're looking for early on. The Gilded Great Shield is phenomenal, but you won't have the strength requirement or the strength needed to use it early on in the game. So even though it's a good pickup, you'll probably want to be farming these two shields, and the Brass Shields drop from enemies that are carrying them, and the Lordsworn Shield drops from the enemies with spears that are carrying them. So you'll want to farm these two enemy types in order to get one of those two shields. So the next thing you want to be on the lookout for is a good sword, and the Lordsworn Straight Sword can be farmed from enemies in the Gatefront Roads that are using them. It's just like a regular looking sword. And why this is so good is that its crit damage is 110, or its crit multiplier is 110, compared to the 100 of the weapons that you'll be using currently. And this allows you, when you go in for that critical strike after a block counter, to do even more damage. So this is a good choice if you want more damage on those block counters, on those critical attacks. Another option is the Noble Slender Sword, which you can farm from, like the nobles that are wandering around in the caravans on the landscape, etc., that carry the sword. They must be carrying it. And you can farm that, and it has even longer reach, and it has the same critical damage as the Lordsworn Straight Sword, so more than either the Longsword or Broadsword, which is great for those critical attacks after block counters, but it takes a really long time to farm in my experience. So you're probably better off going with the Lordsworn Straight Sword early on, so you don't spend so much time farming it right at the beginning. And then the last thing is armor. You can get good armor from the knights there or the warriors in the Gatefront Ruins, particularly the one with the Gilded Great Shield and Spear that has very good armor. You're trying to get over 51 poise with this build, or 51 poise or more, so that when you do like a block counter and an enemy strikes you mid it, you don't get interrupted. You can finish the animation, or if you're attacking with Sacred Blade, it can actually go through enemies, or you can fire it off without getting interrupted. So you're looking for anything that really improves your armor rating here. It doesn't have to be anything specific, but what's really great is you can farm the shields, the sword, and the armor all at the same time. So talking a little bit about Sacred Blade, what I really like about this Ash of War is that it gives you a ranged option that does some damage. It buffs your weapon for a bit of time, so you get even more damage when you're attacking. It connects with the blade and projectile if you're point blank, so you can deal a lot of damage to an enemy if you're point blank with this and you swing. It's a good way to buff your weapon if your buffs run out. Like, this isn't an Ash of War that you're just going to spam the projectile on, because it's just not FP efficient. But you will rebuff with it, and doing it point blank is actually more effective than long range when you can, because you get even more damage. And something I also want to mention about Sacred Blade is at the beginning of the game, it'll let you put Standard Infusion or Holy Infusion. Holy Infusion is a bit more damage, but some enemies, particularly bosses, resist Holy damage early on in the game, so you might want to swap it to Standard at a Site of Grace before you do those fights, and then, put it back to Holy afterward. The buff from Sacred Blade itself will still give you extra Holy damage, but the whole, base weapon damage, etc. will be physical if you put it on Standard. So you'll have a better, you'll do a little bit more damage than you would if you're Holy, essentially. So if you started as a Confessor, you also have a Finger Seal, which you'll use in your left hand. You can swap back and forth between it and your shield, cast incantations when you need them. There are not a lot of great ones at the beginning of the game. You're going to gain more better incantations for this build as you progress. But if you need that Finger Seal, you can go to Round Table Hold when you get there and buy it from the vendor there. But eventually you will want to swap this out for the Clawmark Seal, and that's because this seal scales with strength and faith, and because typically with this build you're going to be wanting to use a Great Shield eventually, you need high strength to do that. You're going to have a lot of strength anyway, so why not put it into your seal along with the faith? This can be acquired by gaining a death root by like defeating the Mariner there boss, like on the way to the Third Church of America when you got your Sacred Blade. If you defeat that boss there, and then go behind the Third Church of America and go through the portal there, and go talk to the beast guy and give him the death root from killing that boss, he will give you this seal. And that's a good upgrade for you eventually. And the last thing I'll say about the Paladin is make sure you get the gear that you want before you start upgrading it so you don't waste upgrade materials. So, either get the Noble Slender Sword or Lord Sorin's Straight Sword before you start upgrading, get the Brass Shield or Lord Sorin's Great Shield before you start upgrading, and make sure you get the Clawmark Seal before you start upgrading that one. Because you won't use a lot of incantations at the beginning. There's no reason to really upgrade the Finger Seal, so might as well wait, save yourself the upgrade materials, and upgrade those things. And if you're prioritizing things, make sure you prioritize your weapon first, your seal second, and then your shield last. Upgrading your shield will periodically increase the guard boost, which is great long term, but you don't really need it in the short term. So I would prioritize weapon and seal first, and then, eventually get around to upgrading your shield. So lastly, we come to a mage build, how to play a mage at the beginning of the game. Mages are really strong because they can stay away from enemies and range them down rather safely. They don't always have the strongest DPS early on, but because they can play it safe, they have a little bit of an advantage. And you're either going to play an astrologer or prisoner if you're playing this way early on. I recommend playing as an astrologer. That's what I'm going to be showcasing here. And I recommend taking the golden seed so you can get an extra flask. And the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure you get that extra flask at the first site of grace and skew your flasks more to the FP side of things so that you can replenish FP and cast a lot of spells and keep casting spells, because this is a 95% mage build, so you're going to be casting spells as much as you can. We're not trying to play a hybrid build here. The other thing is keep an eye out for more golden seeds as you go around the landscape and get more flasks. And, if you come to one of the churches or whatever, make sure to upgrade your flasks so that you can get more FP in between checkpoints. That way you can spam more spells. So the first thing you might be wondering is, how do I get more spells as a spellcaster? Where do I go? Well, you will need to rescue Sorceress Selene first, and she's in the Waypoint Ruins, which are like southeast-ish of the Gatefront Ruins. You're going to go in there. There's going to be a Pumpkinhead dude. You need to kill that guy. I meleeed him. I think it's easier than, using spells because his head just protects damage. So try and melee him. This might take you a few tries. No big deal. Once you get him down, you'll be able to buy spells from Sorceress Selene there. Additionally, if you ride further south on the road, there's going to be like a point where there's like a couple mages ranging at you, a guy on horseback and a bunch of enemies. If you ride up near one of them or you get up there, there is a like scroll laying on the ground near one of the sorcerers. If you pick this up and bring this back to Selene, she'll have even more variety of spells that you can buy. So make sure you do that right away. Like, that's just a quick way to increase her inventory and give you more spells. So once you have that done, the next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to ride all the way over to Caelid in the middle of Caelid. This is a really long ride. I suggest getting the checkpoints along the way, but you don't have to fight anything. We're heading over there in order to get the Meteorite Staff. This is the best early game staff in the game. You don't need to upgrade it. It already has S scaling. It's fantastic. And you're just going to want to ride over there. Make sure you stay on horseback because the swamp is like really poisonous, and just ride around, pick that up, and you're going to have a much improved staff. There is also a spell right nearby that Meteorite Staff called Rock Sling, which is fantastic. This spell does physical damage compared to the magic damage of most other spells you're going to have early on. And that's really good for enemies that are resistant to magic damage. And it also has very high stagger damage. Like if you use this on a dragon, for instance, you can stagger them by hitting them in the head repeatedly with it, knocking them down. I actually recorded a video of this, but my power cut out right as I killed the dragon, and then it corrupted the file. So, fortunately, I don't have the footage here. But you can do this. It's a very, very strong spell for staggering. But the main thing about it has a very long cast time. And if enemies are aggressive, it's very hard to use against them. So use it in certain situations, but you won't use it all the time. And I recommend early on either packing Glintstone Pebble and Rock Sling, or Glintstone Pebble and Glintstone Arc. Arc is good when you know you're going to be facing a lot of enemies, so that you can just like cut through them all. Or if you're fighting an enemy maybe like on horseback, so like if your spell misses a little bit, the arc will usually fan out and hit them anyway. So those are good scenarios to have that. You'll kind of swap back and forth between probably those three spells early on. Carrion Slicer is also really good as a melee spell if you don't have a good melee weapon, which you probably won't. So it's not a bad one to rotate in there either, particularly if you really like it. It's one of my favorite spells. So make sure you use Carrion Slicer as well. And that's pretty much all the equipment you need to get going on this build. The other thing is Memory Stones, which will give you more spell slots that you can slot more spells in, so you can cycle through more spells. You'll pick these up as you progress the game. There's one in Weeping Peninsula. There are many in Learning of the Lake. So as you go into those areas, make sure you do like the big rises and solve their puzzles in order to get those memory stones so you can equip more spells. So that wraps up 5 really strong early game builds to get you going. I haven't explained in how, to get them all off the ground. And you'll notice I didn't really go into talismans too much. That's because you only start the game with one talisman slot, and, you know, you may or may not get the talismans depending on where you're going, and you're going to get a lot of other good ones later on, and you'll just add them onto your build. But I wanted to give you, like, quick and dirty of how to get these builds off the ground so you can start playing their playstyle and not worry too much about that. Stay tuned for more Elden Ring content throughout January, February, and onward as we prepare for the DLC. And if you guys have any specific builds you want to see or guides, let me know in the comments.